Good afternoon, or evening, whichever. Close enough. So we're on the cusp. So after this morning, and I don't know, y'all that have been around here a while kind of remember that I've had these fits before where I start coughing and lose my voice for a little bit. But then I hadn't done that in a long time, but it's been happening here at school here the last couple of weeks. But I've dodged it here until this morning. So I have one of these kind of lessons that if I feel like I'm going to start coughing, I'll just jump to the end. But as long as I don't feel like I'm coughing, I'm just going to keep talking. And so let's see what happens. Prayers going up right now for my voice. I can feel it. And some of y'all are counteracting what the other ones are praying for. So I just wanted to do a little character study on one of my favorite Old Testament characters. Probably near the top of my list of favorite Old Testament characters is Elijah. But we're not going to talk about him. We're going to talk about his replacement, Elisha. And another just really fascinating character in the Old Testament that does a remarkable number of things. And so this afternoon, as I was reading through, it kind of struck me how many miracles Elisha is involved in. We'll talk about some of those as we move forward. Not to talk about all of them in detail, but just to kind of mention them to get a flavor for the fact that Elisha was busy. He did a lot of stuff and a lot of diverse things, a lot of really interesting things, and some things that specifically foreshadow some of the miracles that Jesus performed. So we are first introduced to, I'll say the wrong name 50 times tonight probably. We are first introduced to Elisha in 1 Kings chapter 19. In 1 Kings 18, we have Elijah, the prophet, with his great victory over the prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel. And he, that great scene where they build the altar and he calls down fire from heaven and God shows up and it licks up the sacrifice and the altar and the stones and the water and the dirt and everything. And then they slaughter all the prophets of Baal. It was a great day for Elijah. And then at the beginning of chapter 19, Jezebel's not happy about it. So Jezebel, the wicked queen, she basically offers a bounty or a reward for Elijah. And so Elijah flees. And so Elijah goes from literally a mountaintop experience to where he's fleeing for his life. And he winds up, after a 40-day journey, winds up at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the mountain of the Lord, where Moses had received the Ten Commandments, where they had made the covenant with God, where Moses himself had seen God. Remember, he asked to see God, and God said, well, you can't see me and live, but I will place you in the cleft of the rock, and I'll put my hand over you, and I will pass by in front of you, saying my name. And so Moses saw God's back as God did that for Moses. That's Mount Horeb. That's where Elijah went to. And so Elijah escapes Jezebel, and God basically says, what are you doing here? I've got work for you to do. We don't have time for this, Elijah. There are things that you need to be doing. And so in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 15, this is where God just tells Elijah, look, get back to work. He says, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And so there's our first mention of Elisha, that God specifically calls him as the one that Elijah is to anoint as his own replacement. And so Elijah does. He leaves that place and he goes back to where God sends him. And then verse 19, just a few verses later, it says, so he departed from there. And the first thing he does after he leaves that place is he finds Elisha. And it says he found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, while he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed over to him and threw his mantle on him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, please let me kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow you. And he said to him, go back again, for what have I done to you? So he returned from following him and took the pair of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the implements of the oxen and gave it to the people. And they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and ministered to him. So Elijah becomes a mentor to Elisha. Elisha follows him and ministers to Elijah. So that's our first introduction to Elisha. There in kind of not too near the end of Elijah's life, but Elijah is getting ready for his ministry to be over, and God anoints him, or has Elijah anoint him as his replacement. And then in 2 Kings chapter 2, we have Elijah being taken up into heaven. Elijah along with, wasn't it Enoch at the beginning of, in Genesis, were the only two people that we have record of that did not die, but rather were taken up by God without facing death. And so Elijah here in 2 Kings chapter 2, we see that it's Elijah's time to go, but he is not going to die. And so there's some interactions that Elisha has with some people. In verse 1, it says Elijah went from Gilgal, and Elijah says to him, stay here. You don't want to see what's about to happen next. And Elisha says, oh no, I'm coming with you. You're not getting rid of me that easy. So he goes, and then there were sons of prophets there at Bethel who came out and told Elisha, don't you know that the Lord is going to take your master away today? And Elisha says, of course I know that. Just be still. This doesn't concern you. And then they go to a new place, and Elijah again says, stay here, don't go with me. And Elisha says, oh no, I'm coming. I'm going to be with you the whole time. And as the Lord lives, and you yourself live, I will not leave you. That's verse 4. And so they went to Jericho. And there again, the prophets come out at Jericho, and they say to Elisha, do you know that today's the day? And Elisha says, yeah, I know. Be still. You don't have to tell me things that I already know. And so they have these interactions, and finally Elijah says to him one more time, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan. And so for a third time, Elijah tells Elisha, don't come with me. And so Elisha, for the third time, says, no, I'm coming. I'm with you all the way. And so they were followed by 50 of the prophets from Jericho, presumably there, and they stood opposite the Jordan. And Elijah takes his mantle off his coat, and he throws it on the waters of the Jordan River, and the Jordan River splits, it parts, and they walk across on dry land. And we've seen this happen before, haven't we? Didn't Moses part the Red Sea, and didn't Joshua part the waters of the Jordan River? And so we've seen these waters parted before, and here Elijah does this as they go across the Jordan. And then there's read chapter 2. There's the whole story of Elijah, the chariots of fire, and he says, you can to Elisha, you can ask me for whatever you want to ask me. And Elisha in verse 9 says, please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. I've seen the things that you've done, Elijah. I've heard about what you did at Mount Carmel. I've seen the things that you've done since then. I've been your constant companion for all this time, and I've seen what you've done, and I've seen the power by which you've done those things, and I've seen how God has blessed you. And if you're leaving me to follow in your footsteps, I can't do it of my own power. I can't do it of my own volition. I need the same power. In fact, I need more power than you've had, because you're a better guy than me. And so Elisha here, on the one hand, shows great wisdom, and I think on the other hand shows great humility in asking that a double portion of Elijah's spirit be granted to him, because he knows that he needs that. Power in order to be successful at what God is going to ask him to do. And so Elijah says, you've asked for a very difficult thing, but if you see what happens next, that means God has answered your request. If you don't see what happens next, presumably you're on your own. So what happens next is that whirlwind comes, and there's the chariots and the fire and the horses and all of that, and Elisha saw it all happen. And as Elijah is being taken up, his mantle drops, his coat that he was wearing drops, and Elisha picks that up. Remember, that's the mantle that Elijah had placed on him when he called him in the first place. And that was the mantle that he had used to part the waters of the Jordan. And Elisha goes and he throws that mantle on the Jordan River, and it divides, it splits, so that he can walk across on dry land. And so that's a sign to Elisha that he does, in fact, have, he has the blessing of God. He is going to be able to continue in Elijah's footsteps and be able to do the things that Elijah did as well. And so over the next several chapters, just a series of fascinating thing after fascinating thing that Elisha does. And these are not the ones I want to talk about, but he meets with a widow, and Elijah had his own interaction with a widow that she was out of food, and Elijah blessed her so that she could have a never-ending pot of flour and oil so that she could continue to feed her son. But Elisha has his own interaction with a widow who can't provide for her family, and he says, well, take that little bit of oil that you have in your home and gather all the vessels you can gather and borrow them from whoever you can borrow them from and start pouring that oil, and it'll fill up every vessel in your house. And she does that, and she's able to sell that oil then and provide for herself and her son. And so then there's an occasion where there's a couple that wants to provide for Elisha a place to stay as he's making his journeys about Israel. And so they basically build a room for him on their house. And Elisha says, well, what can I do for you in return? They said, that's not why we did it. But Elisha grants this couple the ability or prophesies that they will have a son because they're childless. And so they have a son, and later that son dies. But Elisha resurrects the son by the power of God. He sends his servant Gehazi to try and resurrect him while he is making his way there, because Gehazi was younger, he could run faster and get there. But Gehazi couldn't do it, even with Elisha's staff. And it was not until Elisha got there that God granted that miracle to take place. So it was Elisha that had that Spirit of God upon him so that he could raise the child. There was a scene where they're chopping wood, and the axe head goes in the water, and it was a borrowed axe head, which means you have to replace it, right? And so he couldn't replace it. If he'd been able to replace it, he wouldn't have had to borrow one in the first place. So the guy was chopping with the axe, and Elisha throws in a stick, and the axe head floats. I've seen a lot of neat things, but I've never seen a floating iron axe head. There was a scene where the army had traveled and they didn't have any water, and Elisha said, well, dig some trenches and the trenches will fill up with water, and that happened. And another scene where there was a spring that was polluted, that you couldn't drink the water out of the spring, and so Elisha threw in a jar full of salt, and it purified the water so that they could drink of the water. There was another scene where there was somebody made some stew to feed the people, and they put in poisonous gourds. They didn't know what they were doing, and they put in a poison plant, and they said there's death in the pot, and Elisha purified the stew so that the people could eat the food and not waste it, and they would be filled. So just interesting miracle after miracle, and there was some of them kind of match up with things Elijah did. Some of them kind of are foreshadowing of things that Jesus did, or that Jesus talked about. Jesus is the water of life, or he provides the living water, and Elisha on a couple of different occasions has things to do with providing water for people. He also, on an occasion, multiplies food. There's people that are not enough food to go around, and Elisha said, well, just start feeding them and it'll be okay, and there'll be some left over. And at the end, there was food left over. And, Jesus fed the 5,000 in the same way, that there wasn't enough food to go around, but just start feeding them and it'll be okay. And so just a series of interesting things that Elisha does that are kind of unique in the Old Testament. Not a ton of people in the Old Testament just going around performing lots and lots of miracles. But Elisha, almost everything that we see with him, there's something miraculous going on around him, or there's something that he is involved in. Of course, you know the story of the healing of Naaman dipping in the Jordan River, and that was one of the big ones when we were kids in Bible school. That's the one with the flannel graph, right? With the going to the Jordan and dipping in the water 7 times and all that. So Elisha involved in some very significant moments and very significant miracles in the history of the Israelite nation. So that kind of gets us to where I want to talk about, chapter 6, 2 Kings chapter 6. The king of Aram, in verse 8, it says, was warring against Israel, and he wanted to take out the Israelite king who is, I forgot which king we're on now. Is it Jehoram? And he wants to take out the king. And Elisha, every time he devises a plot to take out the king, Elisha knows about it because God tells him what the plan is. And so a couple of times, Elisha sends word to the king, don't go over there because they're plotting against you and they're going to kill you. And so the Aramean king believes that there's a spy in his midst, and they say, no, it's not a spy. It's because their God is telling Elisha what we talk about behind closed doors. And how they knew that, I don't know, but that's what was happening. And so the king's new plan is, well, if we can't kill the king, we'll kill Elisha. That seems to make sense. If we can't take out the king because God is telling the plans through Elisha, maybe we can take out Elisha because God might forget to tell him the plans about taking out Elisha, I guess. I don't know, but that's the plan. We'll take out Elisha. And so they track him to Dothan, a city, and his servant gets up. In verse 12, it says, one of his servants, that's later on. In verse 15, now the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, and behold, an army with horses and chariots circling the city. And his servant said to him, alas, my master, what shall we do? He sees the city, the army of the Aramean king surrounding the city, and he knows we're doomed. We can't do anything about it. And Elisha, in verse 16, has this wonderful answer. He says, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. But there was no army there. The Israelite army wasn't stationed in this place. We don't have an army. But in verse 17, Elisha prays, and he says, O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So there's this big army provided by God that is surrounding the enemy army, that is protecting the city that they are in. And Elisha can see that from the very beginning. Remember, at the very start of his ministry, when he asked Elijah for a double portion of his spirit, Elijah says, if you see what happens next, that means you are blessed by God. And he saw the chariot. He saw the horses of fire. He saw the whirlwind. He saw that. And it makes you wonder if just Elisha then from that moment on had his eyes open to a spiritual realm that we can't even comprehend, that we can't even imagine. And so he's seeing the things that no one else can see because God has granted him that double portion of Elijah's spirit. And in this case, he asks for his servant to be able to let him see what I can see. I can see the protection of God, and I can see that it's going to be okay. And an interesting correlation here is that if you look in 1 John chapter 4, 1 John chapter 4, lest we think that this is kind of a one-time thing, that that the enemies are aligned against God's people, and on this one occasion that God decided to act and do something to protect his people, that's not the way it is. Look at 1 John chapter 1, verse 4. 1 John chapter 4, verse 4. John there says, you are from God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. What was it that Elisha had told his servant? Back in verse 16, he says, do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. It's almost the same thing. It's certainly the same thought that John is telling his readers, that we don't have to be afraid of what the world throws at us. We don't have to be afraid of what those who deny Christ are planning and plotting against us, because the one who is with us is greater than the one who is with them. And so whatever schemes and plans they can devise against us, we have protection against those things from the God that we serve. And so it may not always take the form, or it may not always look the way that we wish it looked or the way that we think it should look, but rest assured that God is always there, and there is always protection for his people. And so just like that servant was not able to see the protection in the moment, and he had to have his eyes open to it, sometimes we feel helpless in that moment, but the protection is there. We just have to find it. We have to open our eyes to it. So it comes about then, of course, that Elisha in this moment is delivered, and they actually have almost a comical exchange with the army, where the army is struck blind and Elisha leads them into the center of their nation, and then they have their eyes open. They realize they're now surrounded by the Israelite army. And so, but they don't get to kill all the bad guys. They have to feed them and send them home. because that wouldn't have been nice to kill them, even though that's what they wanted to do. So they feed them all and they send them home. And then the Aramean king decides, well, I'm going to get a bigger army and we're going to try this again. So they did. Ben-Hadad in verse 24, they get an army together and they siege Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom. And there's a great famine, and it's terrible conditions, so bad that you could buy a donkey's head for 80 shekels of silver and a fourth of a cab, which is about 2 quarts. 1 cab equals 2 quarts. So that'd be about a pint of pigeon dung for 5 shekels of silver. And that's what you're going to fix for supper. That's gross. But it's all they had, and they were starving. And so that's what they were eating. And it got so much worse than that, even that there were 2 women that made a bargain with one another. Today, we'll cook your child and we'll eat your child, and tomorrow we'll cook my child and we'll eat it. And so then as they were walking through the city, or as the king was walking through the city, one of these women cried out to him and said, she's gone back on her word. Yesterday we ate my child, but now she's hidden hers from us and we're hungry. And so the king tore his clothes, and he knew that this is as bad as it gets. It can't get any worse than what it is right now. And so he was fed up. He was ready to kill Elisha. Elisha is a man of God. He's the one that should be protecting us. He's the one that should be calling on God to get us out of this mess. And so the king is looking for Elisha to kill him. And then at the beginning of chapter 7, Elisha says in verse 1, tomorrow about this time a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria. So things are going to change in 24 hours. What you're seeing today is not going to be the same thing that you'll see tomorrow. And one of the royal officers said, behold, even if the Lord should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? Even if God opened up the storehouses of heaven and just dumped food on us, is it possible that we could recover that quickly? And Elisha says, yes, and you'll see it, but you won't get to participate in it. That's because of your lack of faith. That's what it will get you. So we're introduced to 4 lepers in chapter 7 that were stranded outside the gate. You can't let the lepers inside the city, but the lepers don't want to be out there amongst the invading army either. So they're in the safest place they can get, which is the gate of the city. And they decide we either can go in the city and they'll kill us, or we can go to the invading army and they might kill us, or we can stay here and we're going to die. Whatever we do, we're dead. So we might as well go see if that army over there will save us, because we can't make it on our own otherwise. And in verse 5, they arose at twilight to go to the camp. And when they came to the outskirts of the camp, it was empty. There was nobody there. And turns out, in verse 6 says, the Lord had caused the army of the Arameans to hear a sound of chariots and the sound of horses, even the sound of a great army, so that they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. And they ran away. They left everything they had and they ran. And so here these 4 lepers have discovered that they have single-handedly conquered an entire army. They've done it. So they got up and they started going into the tents and they started eating and they started hoarding things for themselves. And then look at verse 9. They said, we are not doing right this day. This day is a day of good news, but we are keeping silent. If we wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore come, let us go tell the king's household. Think about these 4 men for a moment. How much kindness had they been shown? How well had they been treated? How nice were people to them? In this time of famine, do you think that there were people inside the city that were sacrificing what little food they had to try to help these leprous men? They were at the bottom, literally at the bottom of the barrel. They were forgotten by those that had bigger troubles than some leprous guys outside the gate. But in this moment, their response is beautiful. What we are doing is not right. This is a day of good news. How often do we, when somebody has mistreated us, when somebody has harmed us in some way, when somebody hasn't been nice to us, Do we have the chance to kind of flaunt our good news and say, well, you thought you were getting one over on me, but look what's happening in my life, and I'm getting one over on you now. That's kind of a typical response. That's kind of the way that we maybe have a gut reaction to respond that way and sort of flaunt our good fortune in the face of others that have been unkind to us. And they had that opportunity here. In fact, they almost did it. They started to do it. They started to take for themselves and forget about those people in the city. They're not our problem. They're not our worry. But then it dawned on them that what they were doing was not right. And they changed what they were doing. They made a change for the better. And what a tremendous lesson we can learn from 4 leprous men. We don't even know their names. We don't know what happened to them after this. But we know that they saw that what they were doing was wrong, and they made it right. And then they went and shared the good news of what had taken place in their lives with the rest of the city. It was such unexpected news that the king almost didn't believe them. He said, this is a trap. They're just laying in wait for us. We're going to send our army out there to start gathering that stuff, and then they're just going to spring on us, and they're going to attack us, and they'll get in the city, and it'll all be over. So we're just going to play it out. We're just going to wait. And the people are starving. The people are hurting. And so finally, one of the advisors convinces him, look, let's send a few people. We've got 5 horses left that we haven't eaten yet. Let's send them out and see if this is really true. And so they send out some scouts and find out, sure enough, it's true. And by the end of the day, guess what's taken place? Well, they were trading barley and flour in the gate of the city. The previous day, you struggled to find a quart of bird droppings to be able to eat. And 24 hours later, you're able to find flour and barley and things like that to be able to eat. And that's exactly what Elisha had told them to do. And so what happened to the guy, so down in verse 16, so the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans, and a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. Now the king appointed the royal officer, on whose hand he leaned, to have charge of the gate. We got to keep an orderly procession of people going out there to plunder the enemy's camp, right? We can't just have people acting all crazy. But the people trampled him. You think you're going to hold back starving people from going out to plunder the enemy camp? They trampled him at the gate, and he died just as Elisha had said. And so a day of good news turns into this one man a day of tragedy, because he was unwilling to accept what God had said through the prophet. He was unwilling to accept that good news could come at the lowest point. And sometimes I fear that we get kind of into that same mode of thinking where things have gone so bad for so long, or we're stuck in a rut of misery, or we're stuck in an attitude of hopelessness that at times, and then we can't believe it will ever get better. And so somebody shares with us the good news, the truth of what God has promised, and it's just hard to accept. It's hard to believe that God can be that good in the midst of the pain or the hurt that I'm feeling right now. And so we become like this royal official who is unwilling to partake of what God has blessed us with, of what God has promised us. And we get left behind while the rest of God's people go out and feast. And so I think there's a couple of good lessons there for us about making sure that when we're in the midst of that good news, that we don't hoard that for ourselves. We take that example of the lepers, and we share that good news with other people. And then when others share the good news with us, that we don't act in an unfaithful way, that we don't turn aside from that good news and believe it to be too good to be true. And so those are kind of the takeaways or the lessons that I hope that we can get from this example from Elisha's life tonight. And I didn't expect to make it this far before I was coughing, so I don't quite know how to stop talking. But I think I'll just wrap it up by saying that, if you want an interesting character to study, Elisha will not disappoint. And all of these little examples from his life can be examples that build up our own faith as well. So if you have any need that we can help you with tonight, any requests or questions that we can answer about the Bible, then we hope that you'll take advantage of that. And if you would, come while we stand and sing.